Hello everyone, Sientir here with another Rambler for you, and today I want to talk about some game design. It's been a little while since I've done that, and it's something I enjoy. The specific topic that I want to discuss today is risk and reward, and kind of balancing that with other methods of accomplishing the same thing. And I'm going to do that by specifically kind of looking through the lens of the Dark Souls parry system, which is something that got changed over between games. So with Dark Souls 1, the parrying worked a certain way, and they kind of tweaked how the idea of it worked or how it kind of functioned. And I'll get in a little bit in what they did specifically. But first, I kind of want to explain how the Dark Souls combat system works sufficiently so that way my discussion of how parrying works and fits into it can be understood. So the general idea of the Dark Souls games, just a very simplified view of how combat works, is you have your character. You have a certain amount of hit points, you have stamina, which you use to perform most actions, parrying, blocking, attacks consume stamina. So you usually have just a very simple view again, a sword and a shield, or some sort of weapon and a shield. And the shield will allow you to block attacks, but the amount that it will reduce damage by varies based on the shield. And also the shield, not all shields can parry in the games, but in Dark Souls 1, most shields can parry. I think that's probably true of Dark Souls 2 as well. Dark Souls 3 is a little bit more complicated. But parrying also takes some stamina. Blocking attacks consumes some stamina. So basically blocking turns damage that would be dealt to your health into damage that's dealt to your stamina. If all of your stamina goes away while you're blocking, your guard is broken, and that usually leaves you pretty vulnerable for a little period of time. The other thing that you need stamina for is dodging actions that help you get away from the enemies. You can still walk and stuff without it, but you can't attack, you can't dodge, you basically can't block without stamina. So it's really important that you have stamina. And Souls games generally deal, we usually refer to the Dark Souls trilogies as Souls games. So when you tend to take a lot of damage from enemies in this. So when you're in a combat situation, you want to defeat an enemy before they defeat you. Usually you want to avoid taking damage from them as much as possible, using a combination of things like dodging, blocking, just moving out of the way, things like that. And so when you're in this system, what the parry does is as an enemy is attacking you, you can perform the parry action. Then if you timed it right, if you got the right timing, it will push back the enemy's attack and leave the enemy in a state where you can get a high damage critical attack off on them. The danger here, the risk of this, so that's the reward, is you've put the enemy in a vulnerable state where you can get a high damage attack off on them, which usually helps defeat them fairly quickly, or can certainly speed up the process. It depends upon some factors like how good your weapon is at performing these sort of critical hits, and like how much health the enemy has, things like that. How much damage you're able to deal with your weapon overall. But usually with one of these attacks, you can defeat an enemy in 1 to 2 hits, as opposed to sometimes it might take multiple, especially depending upon your weapon. Lighter, faster weapons tend to take much longer to defeat enemies, but tend to deal more damage when you perform one of these actions in terms of a multiplicative effect to their base damage. Now, the risk to parrying is if you get the timing wrong, you'll miss entirely, because remember, because performing a parry action effectively stops you from blocking if you were previously blocking. So if you perform the parry with the wrong timing, you'll either straight up just get hit, which usually deals a lot of damage, or you'll get something that's called a partial parry, where you still take a bunch of damage, usually not quite as much as just like taking the hit, but it also drains like all of your stamina. It's like a really bad block that just like still you take a bunch of damage and all of your stamina is drained, so it leaves you in kind of a vulnerable place. So that's called a partial parry, because you partially parry the attack, but not really. So both of these are really bad, because one of them you're just straight up getting hit, which is not great. And the other one is you're basically getting hit, but worse. So if you get the timing wrong, it's really bad. Now, the timing window is the part that's generally gotten tweaked over time. In Dark Souls 1, it was a fairly generous timing window on most shields. The caveat to that is, of course, every attack, you have to kind of figure out when it is that you actually need to parry in order to be able to parry it. Because the parry timing, and this is true across all games, the parry timing requires you to react to what attack are they performing, what is the window in which I can parry this attack. For example, some attacks have a very, very long wind-up, where if you perform the parry action as soon as it looks like they're beginning to attack, you're in the tail end of the parry animation, where it's no longer active as a parry, but you can't really do anything else and you'll get hit, and things like that. So you definitely need to make sure when to do it. Slow attacks like that tend to be a good way of catching the player off guard, incidentally. But in Dark Souls 2 and 3, Dark Souls 2 generally narrowed the window and put it fairly late in the parry animation, which means that you have to be precise, and you have to be precise with enough lead time to be able to actually catch it, right? Because you needed to hit the moment when your parry was active. Dark Souls 3 has some shields are much better for parrying with, but they tend to be shields that are very bad at blocking. They have very low what's called stability, which is how well they take a hit. So if you try to block with them, you'll generally take a good bit of damage because they don't reduce damage very well, and it'll generally cause a lot of stamina damage as well. So in Dark Souls 3, you're generally picking between, can I realistically parry reliably with this shield, or can I block attacks with this shield? In Dark Souls 1, you could basically pick both. Now, this is the sort of how things work side of things, and what you run into is there needs to be a balance between risk and reward. So the risk, again, with parrying is that you fail your timing and you take a bunch of damage. The reward is you get a lot of damage off, you create an opening potentially for certain types of enemies. In Dark Souls 1 in particular, in all of the games there's enemies where it's hard to find an opening to attack them. But Dark Souls 1, parrying is especially useful, for example, against Silver Knights and Black Knights, which tends to guard and protect themselves when they're not attacking, which means getting openings to attack them effectively can be fairly challenging. The alternative to parrying is to try to find some other opening to attack, to try to perform another critical hit called a backstab, which deals less damage than a riposte, which is what you get off of a parry. But just attacking often works, and this is one of the problems. So in Dark Souls 1, it was very possible, not all enemies could be parried, but against the enemies that could, to become fairly reliably consistent in parrying them. It's much harder to accomplish that in Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 3. Particularly noteworthy in Dark Souls 3 is that you really have to make a trade-off between, do you want to be able to effectively block enemies, or do you want to be able to effectively parry enemies? And most of the time, so here's the risk, right? The risk is you have to use a really bad blocking shield if you want to be able to try to parry enemies reliably, and not all enemies are of a type that can be parried. So you kind of risk your ability to block, or you need to do other stuff to be able to change between shields quickly, and things like that. And it usually takes a bit of practice to be able to learn what attacks can be parried when, and what are the timings for an enemy's various attacks to be able to get an effective parry off. Or you could pick up some sort of weapon that hits hard enough to kind of stagger the enemies, so that way they're in a stun state and can't attack, and just hit them a couple of times to kill them. And this is the problem, is the reward for parrying that damage is often not well balanced against what if I just attack them. In other words, the risk, as the Soul series goes on, the risk of trying to parry relative to the generally safer option of wait for an opening and attack is gotten much more favored towards wait for an opening and attack. It's always been safer to block or wait for an opening and attack than it has been to parry. But in Dark Souls 1, when you're able to consistently parry and get that extra damage, which tended to be fairly substantial and capable of defeating many enemies in, like I said, just a few rounds of this. And even if it didn't, you're able to consistently land these parries frequently enough on enemies that, or at least you're able to get good enough at specific enemies to get the timing down where the reward and the risk were well balanced against normal attacking options. I feel what happened in the future Souls games is that the reward and the risk for parrying did not maintain that. You could not, at least this is my personal experience, and I've definitely seen some other people make mention of similarly, the required effort that you have to go through to be able to parry enemies effectively, to be able to learn that, and then your consistency is just not high enough to warrant it over just normally attacking the enemy. And this is something in game design that you have to be really careful of. If you're going to present a riskier option with a higher reward, you need to make sure that against the normal path of accomplishing the thing, the riskier option and the reward, like players are able to have a reason why they would want to pick the riskier option over the less risky, more standard option. So this right here with the parrying system serves as a good example. In Dark Souls 1, I parried often. Like, I learned how to parry, and that gave me a lot of strength against the enemies that I had learned to parry, because it was worth it to me to learn that. It gave me a way of attacking them that was favorable, and I was able to be consistent enough and not have to sacrifice as much to be able to have the option of parrying. In Dark Souls 2 and 3, 2 in particular, I never really spent all that much time learning to parry or learning timings because it generally was not worth it. For me, I found that trying to learn this timing was substantially difficult relative to just taking my weapon and attacking the enemy. It's unfortunate, I think, because the problem is parrying's risk and the skill required to do it, and the difficulty of sort of mastering the timing got raised high enough that the reward damage that you got from it did not outpace normally attacking the enemy. And that's the danger, because it effectively removed this tool that I used to have access to that made me feel awesome at the game, and also provided me a different means of approach. And it took that tool and it just priced it a little bit too far, just beyond where it was worth learning and mastering. And that's unfortunate. So that's kind of my example of this sort of risk-reward versus like normal. Is it balanced against normal behavior, and just being careful of that. Because if the risk is too high relative to the reward, or even especially if the risk and the reward are not well balanced against other options and other alternatives, and this is where you really run into the problem, right? It's not just that, well, it's a risky option. Is the reward really worth it? It might be, except there's an alternative route that does basically the same thing that is substantially safer, substantially less risky. And if you're not careful with sort of that risk-reward, you can push the entire system so far towards the not worth it relative to the other option that it effectively ceases to be an option for most people. So I think that basically summarizes it. I'd love to hear other examples that you all have of games where they had some sort of risk-reward system that it was just pushed a little too far towards the risk, a little too risky relative to normal or other options, such that it just didn't seem like a viable thing to do to you. I'd like to hear about other examples of that. And I thank you for listening. You can like me on Facebook at facebook.com/SientiersRamblers. You can email me directly at sientir@gmail.com. And if you want to, you can support me financially on Patreon at patreon.com/Sientir. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.